Welcome back to the world of Eichard, where we think like the College Board. Today we're covering topics 8.3 and 8.4. Here's the required content for 8.3, Effects of the Cold War. As communism spread throughout Eastern Europe, the United States adopted the policy of containment, preventing the spread of communism around the world. President Harry Truman outlined the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which stated that the USA would provide military and financial aid to countries resisting communism, including sending the US military if necessary. In 1949, NATO was established, a military alliance pledging collective security and solidarity against communist aggression. It soon included the USA, Canada, and most of the Western European nations. The most significant part of NATO was Article 5, which stipulated that an attack on one of the members would be treated as an attack on all members. In 1955, the Communist Eastern Bloc created the Warsaw Pact, which had basically the same structure. Article 4 of the Warsaw Pact was pretty much the same as NATO's Article 5. NATO was led by the US, while the Warsaw Pact was dominated by the USSR. Unlike the alliances that we saw in the World Wars, NATO and Warsaw Pact members never fought each other. A major reason was nuclear proliferation. The United States and Soviet Union's development of atomic weapons led to a prolonged arms race. By 1953, both sides had developed the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon hundreds of times more powerful than those used against Japan. Intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles extended the range of these weapons, and also allowed for second strike capabilities, meaning if one superpower attacked first, the other one could strike back. This followed the principle of deterrence, the theory that strengthening a nation's military would prevent the enemy from starting a conflict. As the Cold War unfolded, each superpower had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, more than enough to destroy each other and everyone else. This led to the idea of mutually assured destruction. In a war between these two rivals, there would be no winner, only destruction on both sides. The combination of mutually assured destruction and the Cold War alliances meant that the Cold War stayed cold. Neither side directly fought the other. But their rivalry did play out indirectly through a series of proxy wars. A proxy war is a conflict where two opposing countries support combatants that serve their interests instead of fighting each other directly. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union often backed different sides in local conflicts around the world to spread their influence. Sometimes this meant that neither the US or the USSR got directly involved, or sometimes it meant that only one side was directly involved, but with the other superpower providing support to the enemy. Let's look at some examples. First, the Korean War. As World War II ended, the Allies divided the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. The Soviets occupied the north and the Americans the south. This led to the formation of communist North Korea under Kim Il-sung, backed by the USSR, and anti-communist South Korea, supported by the US. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South with Soviet weapons and funding. The North quickly dominated, prompting major US and United Nations intervention to support South Korea. President Harry Truman viewed this as crucial for implementing the containment policy and the Truman Doctrine to prevent communism spreading in Asia. The conflict also saw significant participation from China, which had recently become communist. More on that later. Eventually, an armistice in 1953 established the demilitarized zone near the original 38th parallel border. This conflict was among the Cold War's deadliest, with about 3 million deaths, mostly civilians. The war never officially ended. Next, Vietnam, which actually has two proxy wars. Before World War II, Vietnam was under French rule in Indochina and was occupied by Japan during that war. The communist leader Ho Chi Minh led the Viet Minh against both Japanese and French forces. After the war, he declared Vietnam's independence in 1945, but France sought to regain its colony, leading to the First Indochina War. The Soviet Union helped supply the Viet Minh because they were communist, and the US backed the French because they were fighting communists. The French withdrawal in 1954 resulted in Vietnam's division into communist North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and South Vietnam under anti-communist leader Ngo Dinh Diem. The more famous war was the Second Indochina War, or as the Americans call it, the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese call it the Resistance War against America. Beginning in 1955, the US began steadily increasing the amount of military and financial support to the anti-communist South Vietnamese government to help fight against communist insurgents, as well as communist North Vietnam. This was due to the domino theory, an extension of the containment policy which stated that if South Vietnam fell to communism, it would cause a domino effect of other communist takeovers in Southeast Asia, such as Thailand and Cambodia. In 1963, this escalated dramatically, and millions of American soldiers fought in the conflict until the communists were victorious and united Vietnam in 1975. Now, the Ogaden War between Ethiopia and Somalia. Initially, Ethiopia was led by Emperor Haile Selassie, who was part of the non-aligned movement but more closely aligned with the US because of his resistance to communism. But the Derg, a communist military group led led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, overthrew Selassie, and Ethiopia became communist in 1974, allying with the USSR. Somalia, meanwhile, had originally been aligned more closely with the Soviets, who provided them funding and military equipment, although they were also getting increasing American support as well. During the Cold War, non-aligned countries often liked to get funding from both of the competing superpowers. But when the Somalians invaded now communist Ethiopia in 1977, the Soviets withdrew their support to Somalia, and the US became more friendly with Somalia because they were fighting communists. Ethiopia won the war in 1978. Let's finish up with Nicaragua. The Sandinista National Liberation Front overthrew the dictatorial Somoza regime in 1979 and established a revolutionary government with socialist and nationalist principles. The Reagan Doctrine, which was an aggressive strategy of supporting anti-communist insurgents, came into play. The US government viewed the Sandinista regime as a Soviet-Cuban proxy in Central America, although there was little Soviet involvement. The US armed and trained the Contras, a group of anti-Sandinista fighters. The objective was to disrupt the Sandinista government and stop what was perceived as a spread of communism. This conflict resulted in tens of thousands of deaths and significant economic damage to Nicaragua. There's a lot more proxy wars, but now we gotta move on to 8.4, spread of communism after 1900. Let's start here. As a result of internal tensions and Japanese aggression, Chinese communists seized power. These changes in China eventually led to communist revolution. In topic 7.1, we saw the end of the Qing dynasty and establishment of the Republic of China in 1912, led by Sun Yat-sen, who established the Nationalist Party, or KMT. In 1921, the Communist Party of China was formed. By 1927, the KMT was led by Chiang Kai-shek, who set out to purge communism, beginning a long civil war. The Communist Party initially had relatively small numbers, but they were able to build widespread support among the huge population of Chinese peasants because of their policies of land reform. When the Japanese invaded China in 1937, they agreed to form a temporary united front to focus on fighting the Japanese. After World War II ended and the Japanese were driven out, the Chinese Civil War continued from 1945 to 1949. The KMT received a large amount of financial support from the United States, consistent with their policy of containment against the spread of communism. The Communists, led by Mao Zedong, received assistance from the Soviet Union, although much less than what the US had provided. Despite the financial and technological advantages of the KMT military, the Communists had more popular support and won the war in 1949, establishing the People's Republic of China. The College Board wants you to be aware of the parallels in the establishment of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Like in the Soviet Union under Lenin, land was redistributed to the peasants, and like the Soviet Union under Stalin, 5-year plans were put into place to manage the economy. The first 5-year plan was largely successful, both in its goals of establishing an industrial base and increasing agricultural outputs. The second 5-year plan had more mixed results. Industrial production continued to increase, but agricultural production went down due to a combination of factors. First was the Great Leap Forward, a plan that included collectivization of agriculture and diverting many agricultural workers into industrial production, which meant much less people growing food. This coincided with several bad weather years and resulted in widespread famine. The government ended the Great Leap Forward in 1961. And here's the last part of 8.4. Movements to redistribute land and resources developed within states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, sometimes advocating communism or socialism. Fortunately, we've already seen all the examples that we need. In Asia, we just saw China's land reforms of redistributing land to peasants. Basically, the same goals were also part of Ho Chi Minh's platform during the Vietnamese War of Independence against France. For Africa, we have Ethiopia, where the communist Derg, led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, enacted sweeping land reforms, nationalizing all agricultural land and granting each peasant family possessing rights to their own land. Similar to what we saw in the Russian Revolution, land was also seized from the Ethiopian Church. In Latin America, we already saw the example of Mexico under Lázaro Cárdenas, who enacted Zapatista-inspired land reforms that also redistributed land to peasants. Land reform was also a major part of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which aimed to reverse the inequality and exploitation of the previous regime and establish cooperatives with shared ownership of resources and collectivization of agriculture. That's all for today. See you next time to talk about decolonization.